What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the show. Today we are going to talk about things that I've changed my mind on over the years. And I just was chuckling because I was making a list, and it depends what changed my mind about means. Are we talking about things I've done a complete 180 on? The list will be a little bit smaller. If we're talking about things that I've just like shifted my mind about, then the list is literally endless. And I think that that's a good thing. I think that my, stance on certain things has shifted a little bit. And if we look back to like when I first started personal training, like a decade ago, over a decade ago now, then obviously there was a whole bunch of dumb shit that I learned that is 100% false. And I chose not to include that stuff like, oh, BCAAs don't do anything. Like, great. Like, I don't think you guys need a whole podcast on that. I didn't think that would be particularly interesting. I think we all learn kind of, for lack of a more intellectual way of saying it, like a whole bunch of dumb shit when we start, BCAA, carbs are bad, like, come on, like, you don't need a podcast on that. Carbs are bad. BCAAs don't work. Like, you don't need to, 6 small meals don't boost your metabolism. Like, we don't need a podcast on that, I think, or I just don't think that would be super interesting. So I'm going to pick five things I think I chose that I think will be a little bit more interesting, some of which probably deserve their own podcast after kind of looking and thinking about them for a second. One of which that is its own podcast already, but it will be a good conversation, I think. And so I'm going to do my best to be thorough with these topics, knowing that I'm going to try to get through all 5 of them, and that maybe some of them can have their own podcast. So if you're kind of thinking, okay, this probably could have a bit more nuance, like maybe it could, I'll do my best. We'll see where it goes. I didn't make many notes, and so we'll see what the tangent looks like when we dive into some of these topics. So the first topic is what the optimal amount of protein intake is for muscle growth, let's say. And I chuckle because the first 2 things we're going to talk about have a similar thread where like a paper came out. Let me back up a little bit. If you guys go on to any fitfluencer, coach, whatever, and you type on their page, hey, how much protein should I eat for muscle growth? Unequivocally, you'll get some permutation of the answer, 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight or more. Whether that's translated to pounds, which is like roughly like 0.8 grams of protein per pound of body weight, up to 1 gram per pound of body weight, right? So in kilograms, that'd be like 1.6 to 2.2 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. And I laugh because like when this paper came out, it's a paper by Morton and colleagues in 2018. It's a meta-analysis. It was like this paper that felt like the end of the discussion. You know what I mean? Before that paper came out, I'm sure we knew that this was like a ballpark. Like before 2018, what sort of protein recommendations was I giving? Probably similar, 0.8 grams to up to 1.2 grams. And I think we kind of knew there had been plenty of papers. It's not the first study on protein. Like, of course not, as a meta-analysis. So we kind of knew this already, but it was because a meta-analysis is a study of studies. It's a slightly higher, more highly ranked in the hierarchy of evidence. And it almost was like, all right, case closed, right? And so it gave a lot of coaches this like ammunition to be like, hey, this is it. End of story, closed book, done deal, 1.6 grams per kilogram or more. And, that I don't think that that's a bad recommendation, by the way. Let's start with that. I don't think that that's wrong. And I will say that if you are very interested in this topic a little bit more in depth, go listen to the Stronger by Science. I will link that episode in the description of the podcast. It's where I think Eric Trexler leads a segment where they talk about this study in particular, and that's where I'm going to be deriving some of this discussion here. So if you're interested, you want a little bit more in depth on this topic, go listen to that. It's fantastically done. Eric is wonderful. He does a really great job. But essentially what they did on that podcast, and what we're going to talk about here, is a kind of like a reanalysis of that paper and kind of putting it under the microscope a little bit more, because this idea that it's like, hey, basically what the takeaway was like, hey, if you're under 1.6 grams per kilogram of body weight, we see a decent amount of a drop off in benefit. And above 1.6 gram per kilogram, we see a drop off in benefit, meaning you get much worse benefit below 1.6 grams per kilogram. And above 1.6 grams per kilogram, we see almost like an asymptotic, like diminishing return. So this 1.6 gram per kilogram was seen as like a threshold of like, hey, once we're above this, there doesn't seem to be a ton more benefit. But below this, there does seem to be a drop off where you get significantly less benefit. So this is a really nice marker of like, hey, above this, you're good, but there's probably diminishing returns. And below this, we see a big, a significant enough downside in which we would recommend going above that. And, Eric, I believe, did what's called a leave one out analysis, which is essentially like because a meta-analysis is a study of studies, a leave one out analysis is basically like going through and calculating the data again while removing one study at a time, just to see if one study is really, like if you have data and that data says X and you take out one study out of like 10 studies that are giving you this end result, this data, this conclusion, and you take out one study and it does skew that data quite a bit, then that makes that data a little bit less reliable, right? It's like this one study apparently is skewing this, right? And obviously, technically, we would call that an outlier. None of the papers that were included in this study were statistically considered outliers. They were below that threshold. But I find it funny if you go and you watch the podcast, I recommend watching it on YouTube because there's some pretty decent pictures of the data sets. It actually looks like extremely underwhelming. Like this, the level of confidence with which people say 1.6 gram per kilogram of body weight is this threshold. If you actually looked at the data set plotted out, it doesn't really look that way. And it doesn't really look that way with as much confidence as we say it. And so I believe Greg and Eric, they did a leave one out analysis, and they found that there was one paper that if you took that paper out, then the 1.6 starts to this like threshold of 1.6 grams per kilogram kind of drops to like 1.2 grams per kilogram, which is like roughly 0.6 grams per pound ish. I think it's a little bit more. And it just really wasn't as compelling of a paper in terms of like, if your takeaway is 1.6 grams per kilogram, yeah, it doesn't seem that we should be talking about it with as much confidence as we do. Especially when you took out that one paper. But even if you left that paper in, I saw the data set just like plotted out, and it just was like, like this is the data from which we are deriving this level of confidence around this like 1.6 grams per kilogram. And it just made me take a step back and be like, well, maybe like, especially after doing this leave one out analysis, maybe, again, the guys at Stronger by Science also came to this conclusion, of course, is that maybe we're a little bit too hard-nosed about that number, and maybe it's actually lower than that. And when I say it is lower than that, I mean this point from which above we see diminishing returns and below we see notable downside. That threshold is very likely lower. And so again, if you want a bit more of this, if you want a little bit more meat around this discussion, go check out their podcast. I don't want to steal the entire content there. They did a wonderful job breaking it down. But it is probably more the case, if you're going to use this paper as the holy grail, it's probably more the case that downside or that threshold is probably closer to like 1.2 grams per kilogram, which is like 0.66 grams per pound, which I got to tell you is awesome. That's awesome. I mean, anytime we can lower the bar and find out that there's actually, it's actually easier to get into that quote optimal range, it's amazing. And so what are the main takeaways here? Should you be actively reducing your protein intake? No. I'll tell you how this has affected me, and then we'll move on to the next topic. How this has affected me is that if I have a client who's eating in that like 1.2 grams per pound, 1.2 to 1.4, let's say, it's no longer, in my opinion, an evidence-based position for me to nudge them to go higher. If I have a client who's happy in that 1.2 to 1.4 and they do not like eating more than that, I no longer can stand behind the fact that there is definitively a benefit to doing so, which is awesome. I can think of many clients who are like, maybe you're in the 150 pound range and you're eating like 150 or you're eating 100 grams of protein. That's like 0.66, right? 2/3. That's 0.66 grams per pound, which is like roughly that like 1.2 gram per kilogram. And so they're really happy there. And, maybe we have a discussion about, maybe previously I might have had a discussion of like, going up in protein to like closer to, 130, 125, 130, get closer to that like 0.8 mark. There's a benefit there. That's where we see the threshold continues to go up of how much benefit you're going to get from more protein. Just don't feel that that's an evidence-based position to take anymore. I think if you have you should not be actively decreasing your protein intake unless you don't like how much protein you're eating and you'd enjoy your life more, adhere better, and just, again, overall have a better life if you ate a little bit less protein, had a little bit more room for carbs and fats. Again, protein's great. It has a high thermic effect of food. It's relatively satiating compared to the other macros. Nothing wrong with protein. It's great. And there is probably more benefit to more protein. There just seems to be like where the point is where there's a drop off in benefit seems to be a little bit lower than we suspected. And so again, I think that's fantastic. It's way more inclusive. There's a lot of people out there who don't actually love eating a gram per pound of protein. And if they could get near optimal results with less, it would drastically improve their adherence, but also just general enjoyment with their food. I think that's awesome. And I used to think that I was someone who's like, no, I to be honest with you, I usually eat more than a gram per pound of protein. I weigh 190-ish pounds, and I'm usually north of 2,000 grams of protein. But more recently, I've had some days in like the 150, 160, which is still, close to like 0.75, 0.8-ish. And it's been really nice to not have any feeling that creeps up in me where you're like, you're missing out on gains. Like, that's been really liberating, even for me, who's like a more of I like in terms of palatability, I do enjoy protein and it isn't difficult for me to hit a gram per pound. I've had days where I'm in like that 140 to 160 range, and I'm like, you know what, dude? Like, you're not actually missing out on anything. Like, you can feel just fine about this. And that's been nice. And so if you guys want a bit more detail on that, go listen to the podcast. I'll link it in the description below. It's more like an hour. This was like 10 minutes. If you guys want to look more, I highly recommend watching it on YouTube. Some of those data sets, you're like, you scratch your head and you're like, yeah, but these people talk about it with such certainty, and this is what they're referencing. And when we transition to the next topic, which is going to be training volumes, it's a very similar topic. And so we'll move on to the next topic, which is things I've changed my mind about, and that's training volumes. Like, how much training, how many sets per muscle group per week you need to be doing to make gains. Now, my last podcast, actually there might be one in between this, so maybe 2 episodes ago with Brian Borstein, we talk about this topic ad nauseum. I think we go for like 75 minutes just on this topic. So please go listen to it. I'm going to give you guys some nuts and bolts here, hopefully to whet your appetite enough to go check that out. But it comes from a topic by which if you go on any fitness influencer, coach, and you're like, hey, how many sets per muscle group per week do I need? Unequivocally, 100% of the time, actually maybe even more so than the protein one, you will get the same answer. Something like 10 to 20 sets per muscle group per week. And that is derived from a paper by 2017 by Schoenfeld and colleagues. And again, not a meta-analysis. Actually, it might have been a meta-analysis. I can go back and check, but there's an entire podcast on it that I just did with Brian that I think you guys will absolutely love. I think it is a meta-analysis. And basically, if nobody reads the whole paper. I'm not like, back in 2017, I was not, from a literature standpoint, I was not literate enough to actually go through this paper and come to any of my own conclusions. It was just over my head. And so it was really nice, clean cut, packaged conclusion of like, hey, what's optimal? Somewhere between 10 to 20 sets per week per muscle group. And again, if you go on any influencer's page, any coach page, this is what you're going to hear. And again, I'm not shitting on those people because that was me too. I didn't read the paper. And so I said something if you go through any Q&A where I've ever been asked that question, you'll hear that. More recently, I've had some issues with it, not because I think that is wrong, but some issues with how that is applied. And you can listen to that in the podcast. But it seems like with a closer look, there's more to this paper than just this conclusion of 10 to 20 sets per muscle group per week. That you will hear from every coach, under the sun. A couple of things that I'll note, because there's a whole podcast on this, is that in that 10 to 20 sets per muscle group per week, they counted all indirect work equally. What I mean is that like one set of squats counted as one set for quads, one set for hamstrings, which by the way, don't even really do much at all in the squat, and one set for glutes. One set of pull-ups counted as one set of back and one set of biceps. Now, a couple issues with that. One is like you're counting, the biceps do work in a pull-up, but do they work enough to get an entire set allocated to them? Also, back is many muscles. When you do a pull-up, what about your lats versus your rear delts, your upper back, right? Your teres, within the lat, we have multiple divisions, and are they all counting the same? And so again, because in order to do like actual research, you have to have some limit, like there have to be some limitations in order for you to be a little bit more inclusive with the studies that you're making. And it's really difficult for you to kind of differentiate divisions of a certain muscle when it comes to this. If you did that, you would never be able to have, like, there's just never going to be enough, there's never going to be research out there that breaks it down to that level of specificity. And so again, there's nothing against the paper. Paper was done just fine. But I think the application is kind of lacking in terms of how people understand that the study was done. And what I mean by like the indirect work is like, if I said you need to do 15 sets of biceps, let's say 12 sets of biceps per week to grow them. In my group program right now, we are doing 3 sets of direct bicep work. We're doing one exercise for 3 sets. We're doing no cheat curls this mesocycle, and it's one exercise. We have 3 sets. You might say, well, I'm only doing 3 sets of biceps. I heard I need to do 10 to 20 sets. By the nature of how those 10 to 20 sets are calculated within the study, you might be doing way more than you think, because by the way that that's calculated, all of your back work, so all of your pulling exercise, your rows, your overhead pulls, your in the middle sort of pulls, they all count for biceps. So if you're doing 9 sets of back, maybe you're doing 3 sets of an overhead pull, you're doing 3 sets of a horizontal row, and you're maybe doing 3 sets of something in the middle, like a high cable pull, something like that. That would be 9 sets of biceps. 9 sets of biceps plus the 3 sets of direct work you're doing 12 sets of biceps, which would check the box of 10 to 20 sets per week. So that's a big one that I think people aren't understanding, that would be 12 sets of biceps, and that you don't actually need 12 sets of direct bicep if you're using this 10 to 20 sets per muscle group per week as your parameter. Also, a couple just like little things that I would share about this study is that even the study itself has a quote in there that says, north of 9 sets per muscle group per week and below 9 sets per muscle group per week did not show statistical significance, which I find just like a crazy quote to be in a study. So basically they're saying above 9 sets and below 9 sets didn't show statistical significance. Like when that line was drawn at 9 sets, those who did more and those who did less, it didn't reach statistical significance, which I find to be a crazy quote to be in a paper from which we derive that the optimal amount of growth would be between 10 and 20. Also, if you calculate all the data, if you look at the people who did between 5 and 9 sets per muscle group per week, they saw 84% of the growth that, we deem optimal. So in just 5 to 9 sets per muscle group per week, you can get 84% of the muscle growth. That's epic. That's epic. That could be as low as a quarter of the amount of work. If you're doing 20 sets per muscle group and you could do 5 and still get 84%, I know I'm using the extremes there to make a point, but shit, man, if you could do a quarter of the work at 84% of the gains, like how amazing is that? How inclusive does this now become? And so just reframing my thoughts around how many sets you actually have to do, I think it is still a very nuanced topic. That's why we have a fucking 75-minute podcast on it. I don't think it's like clean cut, like, hey, just do way less volume. But I think that somewhere in here is at least a general thread that this is a big win for people who have less time, regular people, everybody listening to this podcast who's not a professional bodybuilder, that you can still make amazing gains with less if you do certain things. And, if you want to learn more about how to make the most of your time in the gym and get the best gains in a little less time, that is essentially what the podcast with Brian is about. So we talk about this topic of how much volume you need. We look a little bit more in depth in this study and some other studies. And then we kind of give some general recommendations of like how to get more out of your training time, like how to get more out of less time. So go check that out. It'll be in the description. The next topic absolutely needs its own podcast, and I have it scheduled. I literally, as I was making the notes, I texted my friends Buddy Your Macros, Heidi and Natalie, and I knew that they'd be perfect for this podcast. And that is the idea that fat loss will unequivocally all the time improve your life. I think when I started out, I just assumed everybody wanted to lose fat and that losing fat would improve everybody's life, make everybody happier, make everybody more physically fit, and make everybody objectively healthier in terms of biomarkers. And that fat loss was the route to life improvement, to quality of life improvement. Or at least I wasn't as, I didn't scrutinize, I didn't wrestle with that question enough. I guess if you asked me you're like, hey, Jordan, do you think fat loss will improve everybody's life? I probably wouldn't have said yes. I would be, skeptical of those sorts of absolute languages, like, all the time in all contexts for all people. But I am becoming more and more skeptical of that in absolute. I just think after working with hundreds of people for the last decade, I've helped hundreds and hundreds of people lose fat, and it does not always improve their quality of life. In fact, it might even be the case that, depending on the context, like, it can be worse. I'm not going to say that it is always worse. What I'm trying to say is that you absolutely shouldn't be assuming, whether you're a coach or a regular person, somebody who thinks that they would like to lose fat, that this is going to improve your life. I think that assumption in absolute is one that I would not make. And I was going to say, like, I wanted to maybe be a bit contrarian here and say that it's more likely the opposite, that that's not true. But shit, man, I'm way more cognizant than ever that we should be looking more into approaching this from a what's realistically going to make my life better, not an assumption that, my happiest life is a leaner body. And so, again, I think this could be its own podcast. I'm going to touch on a couple of things. I think if from an actual health marker perspective, when we're looking at objective health markers, whether it's like blood lipids or blood pressure or blood glucose or inflammatory markers or, just whatever, risk factors of cardiovascular disease, like things that like objectively we can look at and be like, hey, like these are things that can maybe be improved. I think fat loss can absolutely be something that can improve those things. And so I think if we're looking at like, hey, fat loss can improve my life, for those listening to this who are like, hey, I have certain risk factors that fat loss is very highly likely something that would help that, I'm on board. I think that if you're like, if that's your argument as to like why you think fat loss will improve your life, totally possible that I think that that's a good plan, or at least something very much worth considering. If you're at a state of maybe health, maybe in a certain body size where you think fat loss will give you better like physical fitness and will allow that to open doors for your life to do things physically that you enjoy. You're like, hey, my joints hurt and I can't play tennis, or I can't go on hikes, I can't go for walks, I can't go running, can't play soccer, and literally losing fat will take some of that stress off my joints, improve my cardiovascular fitness, which I think is a two-pronged approach. Fat loss will do that for some people for which fat loss can give cardiovascular benefits. Obviously, improving cardiometabolic adaptations in terms of like doing cardio and getting more fit, that is a different thing. I think that this makes a ton of sense. If you're like, at a body size where you think losing some fat will allow you to do things physically that will improve your quality of life, fuck yeah, I'm totally on board with that. Like 1000% on board with that. And I do not want to, I will only use, I was going to use myself as an example, but I really don't like doing that because that isn't exactly what I will say is this doesn't need to be only something in an extreme sense. I will say that at my heaviest, I was probably 220 pounds, so like 30, 35 pounds heavier than I am right now, depending on the day. I couldn't play soccer as well as I liked. My cardiovascular fitness was dog shit, 30 pounds heavier. Technically overweight, and no pity party for me. This is not what we're doing here. I'm just saying, even in that regard, like when I moved to Texas, I was 220 pounds, and immediately we started playing soccer because we wanted to meet people. And I looked at Jenna and I was like, I don't want to stay at this weight because it wasn't something where I felt cardiovascularly fit. I remember the first game, within the first 2 minutes, I subbed myself out and I was like, this isn't my happiest life here. I think I would be happier because it would, maybe losing some weight because it would allow me to do this thing that I really like physically a bit better and I would enjoy it more. So I think that those categories are fine. I think another one might be like, hey, confidence, maybe improved confidence from fat loss. But I think that this is a tricky one. I mean, where are we deriving confidence from? Are we deriving confidence because, being smaller, I feel like I fit a societal norm better and I, deserve love and I'm getting all this external praise and I'm deriving all these, more superficial good feelings from the way I look, which kind of highlight maybe a little bit of a discussion here about why that might be. Why am I deriving a lot of my good feelings from the way I look? So I think a lot of people are like, I got more confident. It's like, yeah, we could explore that a little bit, I think. This is what 2 years of therapy has done to me. But I think being curious about why that is, like what in me felt like, I needed to be smaller to feel good about myself. I think that there's room to be curious there. And I just think that, again, that can totally happen, by the way. Some people are going to be like, I got more confident. Like, and that can be a very good thing. But I also think it can be maybe even reinforcing some things that are holding you back from your best life. Maybe how much we value how we look and the external and how much body fat we have and our body size and all of that stuff. Maybe there's room for finding confidence without that being such a big variable. That's all I'll say. So again, I think there are two categories where, I think it's more highly likely that fat loss can be helpful in improving quality of life, where you're like, have some objective health markers that maybe aren't the best, and improving that like literally just decreases your risk of dying. I think that makes a ton of sense. And also if, your body size or body fatness is stopping you physically from doing something you want to do or doing it in the way you'd like to do it. And, by losing some fat, that can be a route to doing that in a way that improves your quality of life. Maybe it's going for hikes, going for runs, playing a sport, playing whatever, playing with your kids, playing with your grandkids, whatever. I love that. But if it's, there are, again, I don't want to go too deep on this. Like, there are a lot of people listening to this podcast who are objectively healthy, who don't fall into those two categories. Your blood work checks out, you're objectively healthy. Physically fit, there's probably not anything that you can't do that are hyper focused on being leaner. And I've worked with a ton of them. Like, the majority of my clients probably fall into this category of like, you're pretty darn healthy from an objective, like what we can see physiologically and physical fitness wise. Like, it's not like you're yearning to do something that you absolutely can't do. And this is something that you think will help you do that. There's a lot of people who are looking to lose fat because they just want to look better. Now, I'm not shitting on that as like an independent variable. Like, that can be something that exists within you. But if it is the only thing you care about and you are already like objectively healthy and physically able to do things that, let's say able-bodied, like, I'm just not sure. And I just want to be clear. Like, I'm not saying that it can't improve your health or your quality of life. I'm just not sure that it will do that 100%. And sometimes, I would go so far as to say that with a lot of these clients that I've worked with who were in this category, that the better, more life-changing quality of life improvements have actually come from deciding to focus on other things, working on relationship with food, working on relationship with self and body, working on and finding exercise modalities that they enjoy, maybe just like, learning to that, changing their perspective on body image, let's say. I'm not saying giving up on fat loss, but I guess you could say that. It's tricky, and that's what I mean. It is no longer something I think is a blanket thing that will improve everyone's life. I do not think that is the case. I think a lot of people need to really question why they want to lose fat. What is the goal behind losing fat? Does the type of changes that I need to make to lose fat, do those actually lead to a net improvement in quality of life? Or am I giving up things that I would really enjoy? I'm no longer associating myself with like, I help people lose weight. It's like, I help people use nutrition and fitness to live their best life, whatever that is. And it's not always losing fat. I think that is kind of where I'm going to end this now, because I do think it can be a larger topic, but, yeah, that's something that like I've explored a lot more with clients lately. And sometimes it can be hard for people to let that part of them that's always been focused on fat loss, let that part die. There's like a mourning phase of like the you that's been so focused on like, I need to be smaller since you were a little kid, since you were a teen in school, college, wedding, having kids, whatever. The part of you that decided that he or she needed to be smaller, actually letting that part of you die is an important part of this process in actually having a better quality of life where you're not so hyper-focused on that. So again, I'll leave that for a slightly longer podcast. But again, that doesn't mean it can't improve your quality of life. Just something I've taken a step back from assuming. The next one, I think we have two more. We're doing 30 minutes. Actually, we're pretty good here. The next two are how important biomechanics and technique are. Now, I'll give a little context here. I still think having good technique is massively important. And I still think learning about anatomy and biomechanics is immensely important as a coach. It's something intellectually that's very stimulating for me. I enjoy it. I'm certain, I took all the N1 courses. I went to the N1 practical. It's something I am immersed in learning more about every day. And it's been, let's be real, this idea of like biomechanics and anatomy and like different divisions of the lat, like it's been booming for the last like 5 years, I'd say. Ever since, N1 has been around for longer than that, but N1 probably brought this to the surface of like something that we're being like way more specific with, learning way more about different divisions of the lat, different divisions of the pec, different divisions of the bicep, and how can we train all of those specifically. And that's been incredibly intellectually stimulating. I've enjoyed it a ton. But we'll get to the but in a second. I will also say that if you're a coach, it is your absolute duty to have an understanding of this stuff. If you are programming for clients, you sure as shit better understand this, at least on a foundational level. But social media has turned this into like an absolute language factory. And something I'll just briefly touch on in terms of social media is like, it's a very competitive space now. I mean, everyone's on social media. Everyone's making content. There's a million fitness people on social media. all making content, all competing for your attention. When that competition gets really great, you know what rises to the top. It is absolute language. It is yes and no. It is binary thinking. It is black and white topics. It is, this exercise does this and this only. This exercise does none of this, and this exercise is trash, and this exercise is the best. This absolute language, this, lack of nuance absolutely rises to the top, and that's because it feeds our innate disposition as humans to be attracted to that, to want a simplified answer. And that's okay. Like, we're not going to change anytime soon as humans. Of course, most of us are going to be after, it's simpler to be like, oh, this exercise does this, trains lats, doesn't train anything else. This exercise, okay, it's for your clavicular pec, and that's it. You got to have your arm on this angle for rear delts and this angle for upper back. And yeah, in some ways that makes it seem more simplistic. It's not, this is this and nothing else. This is that and nothing else. And a lot of social media will make it seem like that's the case. And if there's any nuance, it's buried in a caption that nobody reads. People are, I put the nuance in the caption. It's like, okay, nobody reads that. And I'm not I've gone through the blame phase of blaming people for doing this, but they are rewarded. And so how are they, I can't really blame people for doing that, using some of the, I can to some degree, but it's just a social media strategy, and that's great. If you want to go do that, whatever, man, I support everybody's decision to do whatever they want. And when people talk about the algorithm is just a proxy for what humans want. The algorithm is just giving you what you want. And so at the end of the day, it's mostly just that people are after this. That is the real problem, this sort of binary thinking. Anyway, let's not go too deep down that rabbit hole. What have I changed my mind about biomechanics? A little bit of how much this matters, and a little bit of how I'm discussing this on social media. A lot of these changes in terms of hey, you got to have your arm on this angle if you want to work rear delts. Hey, you got to work your arm on this angle if you want to work the thoracic lat. Hey, you got to make sure that your torso's in this position so you can lengthen the rec fem. A lot of that is true. I mean, it is true. But how much does it matter, and how much of your emotion and feeling of self-efficacy with certain movements, your feeling of competency with your lifts, how much should you be giving to that? And again, I think that there's we'll get to that in a second, but a lot of people are, this new fear unlocked. A lot of people are all of a sudden getting in this immense state of anxiety around their technique and their performance, or their technique and how they're performing movements, that they're either not enjoying their training as much, or it's coming at the cost of things like effort. They're like, well, my arm is moving it slightly in this little different plane that it's supposed to, by fucking 5 degrees. And so, I got to lower the weight so that I can get it perfect. And I think that the people who are talking on social media in this way, very absolute language, would probably be like, oh no, it's actually, you're probably okay. You probably don't need to do that. But that's not what's being communicated. And so there are a lot of people who are obsessing over tiny, minute details in lieu of things like effort, let's say. Now, I know that that's a false dichotomy, right? Can you, and I'm not anti-optimal. I fucking love learning about all this stuff. And I have a group with over 700 people where I talk about technique and we work on their technique. And I, sometimes will let them know that I'm nitpicking. But I think what's missing is an understanding of where this falls in the hierarchy. If I give a technique cue to somebody, I'm like, hey, I think maybe you could tuck the elbow a little bit more on this press. I will also add how important I think that is, so that you know that this isn't a huge deal, that you weren't doing it bad before and getting no gains. And now when you fix it, then you'll get all the gains. Now you're finally making gains. We need to understand where this falls in the hierarchy. I'm all for working on technique and learning about the body. Just keep it in context. We need to help people understand how important certain things are, so that they're not having a disproportionate reaction or disproportionate emotional attachment to doing something quote unquote perfectly. The example that I think about is I'm doing an exercise in my program right now. It is a row that is basically a perpendicular row. I'm rowing perpendicular to my torso. I'm rowing horizontally, let's say. And my arms are roughly 30 to 45 degrees up off my body. If you're watching me on YouTube, it's probably about here. I posted it the other day, and I struggled to know what I was going to call it, because the truth is, you could call it a rear delt row, because, that's what's all the rage right now as to being so fucking hyper specific about what you're working. And I thought to myself, yeah, biomechanically, does this fit a puzzle piece of a rear delt row? Sure. But I'm getting a ton of upper back also. I'm getting a ton of my thoracic lats, and I'm getting some rear delts for sure. But it just got me thinking about, fuck, man, like if you want to build a great back, like you want to be pulling from overhead, you want to be pulling horizontally, you want to be pulling from somewhere in the middle. Sometimes you want your elbows flared, sometimes you want them tucked, sometimes in the middle. Yes. Can you be more specific? Absolutely. As a coach, as a client, should you understand some of those nuances? Absolutely. If you have a client who specifically wants to work a certain muscle, should you know how to attack that muscle? Absolutely. But I just think that we've gotten to the point where we're not actually also having the discussion of how important XYZ adjustment to your technique is. And I think that just as long as we're adding that, I'm all for it. Because the truth is, these little changes, sometimes they're very low cost. Like we're not talking about like I will cede the point that these are very low cost changes, like tucking your elbow a little bit or lining up the cable a little bit better for your triceps. Like those don't cost you very much, taking the cable, pulling it down one click so it lines up a little bit better. That's a very low cost option or a very low cost change that will cause some improvement. But we need to accept that these are very low cost, very low benefit. And that doesn't mean you don't do them, but it just means you keep them in fucking context where somebody isn't having analysis paralysis, having anxiety, not enjoying their training anymore because they think their elbow degree is off by 5, And so that's my take on that. I think I love working on technique with clients, but I will always let you know how important what we're talking about is so you can decide how much emotion to give it. If you're doing an RDL and your lumbar spine is completely flexed and rounded and you're just doing like this question mark stripper deadlift where you're certainly going to injure your lower back over time, we're going to have a talk about it. And I'm going to tell you that that's most likely unacceptable to do over the long term. If you're like, hey, I'm trying to target my rear delts, but my elbow's on 47 degrees, not 42 degrees. What should I do? We're going to have a talk about that, but you're sure as shit going to know that this is a totally different conversation where it matters a whole fuckload less. Cool. So something we could talk about another time, maybe its own podcast for sure. And the last one we're going to talk about today, there's plenty more on this list. I want to keep it under 45 minutes. We probably won't do that, but is that cardio will kill your gains. This one I'll start with, comes in tandem with the lower volume. And what I mean by that is that I used to think that, well, it is true that you only have a finite amount of recovery capacity at adaptive capacity. What I mean is there's only so much you can do and recover from it, and there's only so much you can do and adapt to it. You have a finite amount of that. And if somebody is working really hard on hypertrophy, chances are, I thought at one point that they were maxing out their recoverability. It's like you didn't have much room for much else. That's what I had suspected. But that's probably back when I thought you needed to train for at least 90 minutes, 4 to 6 times a week. Of course you don't have any more recoverability because that's a metric fuckload of training, a ton of stimulus that requires a ton of adaptive and recovery capacity from your body. If you're an absolute avid bodybuilder who's training with the sole goal in life to get the most jacked, no matter the cost, you're probably training that much. And if you are, you probably don't have a ton of room for extra higher intensity cardio. You probably can just walk just fine. But as I've learned that you probably don't need as much training as you think to get at least a very high percentage of the optimal gains, you actually have some room for some cardio without it fucking killing your gains and causing you to not recover. I have a podcast with Dr. Alyssa Olenek. It's a wonderful podcast. I think she reposted it on her podcast actually, because I think it was just a wonderful chat with the two of us. I'll put that in the link below or in the description below. You guys can go check that out. But I think it is still true that you have a finite amount of recovery capacity. You can't just do 5 days of distance running and 5 days of hypertrophy and 5 days of jujitsu and expect to kind of recover and adapt to all of that optimally. But I definitely think that we are at the very least overblowing this interference effect, that if it exists in a way less of a magnitude than we once thought. And if we're talking about doing a moderate amount of this stuff, of course, the amount that you're doing something and the level of intensity that you're doing it are two variables that are very important. If you're like, hey, can I add 1 day of walking, which is a low frequency and a low intensity, you could basically add that to any program. You're going to be just fine. But again, if you increase the frequency, now you're doing 3 days and you're doing sprint workouts or whatever it is, maybe long distance running, something that's going to require or cause more fatigue, higher frequency, more fatigue. Obviously, that's filling up your recovery bucket a bit more. That means that you'll have less room for other stuff and maybe more likely to have that overflow and you're, not able to adapt and overtrain or whatever that is, be, overreached and whatever terminology you want to use. But I do think that this, if you're somebody out there, even if you're in my program, which is like slightly more geared to getting more optimal gains, we train 4 times a week for about 60 minutes. Chances are you could add some cardio to that. Like if someone's like, hey, I want to add some cardio, my answer will almost never be, hey, that's going to interfere with your gains. The only answer I would give is, that something's interfering with your gains, let's say, if you are unable to progress at those lifts, let's say. So if someone's like, hey, I want to add X on top of my hypertrophy programming. Is that too much? Or how do I know that that's too much? My answer would be if you are finding out that you are showing up to your hypertrophy workouts so fatigued, maybe sore, or maybe just like from a neurological standpoint, you are in a lesser state, like you're less motivated to train, that could fall under fatigue in some way, that your performance level suffers. Like if you are finding that you're unable to perform to the degree in which you can progress in your hypertrophy sessions, that's a really good proxy for this is interfering with my gains. Not complicated. If you're not progressing in your lifts, right, week to week, at least a little bit, most of the time, again, a little bit, most of the time, sometimes you don't progress, sometimes you even regress. But if you're finding like a consistent regression or at least a consistent inability to progress, chances are you should at least consider if you're doing too much. I've actually come to the point where like I think that at least walking, 8 to 12,000 steps per day on average is something that will actually probably get you better gains just from a recovery standpoint and maybe from a work capacity standpoint. Obviously good for weight management and cardiovascular health. But certainly I'm off the mantle of cardio will interfere with your gains. It almost certainly won't unless you're trying to do an extreme of both. If you're doing a hypertrophy program and that is your main focus and you add a moderate 1 to 2 days of cardio on top of that, as long as you're fueling optimally, you're eating enough and sleeping enough, I think you're going to be just fine. And I don't think it will have any impact on your like hypertrophy goals. I'm going to end it there. There were a couple other ones. I'll mention them here. Maybe I'll do another episode or I'll give each of these their own. 3 other ones were my thoughts on anti-diet culture, which I think that I have a podcast with JB and Rosario, which I think is wonderful. It's kind of updates our thoughts on this like anti-diet culture approach, pre and post-workout nutrition, at the very least pre-workout nutrition. I feel like we're kind of off the anabolic window stuff. But I still get people like, what's an optimal pre-workout nutrition? Like mostly it doesn't fucking matter. And another one that I think definitely deserves its own podcast, which I kind of have, is how important genetic differences are when we talk about predisposition for fat gain, like things about your genetics that make you more or less likely to gain fat over the lifetime. I think that those are actually underrated. And when we talk about obesity as a disease, that we need to actively acknowledge that there are big differences between us. And so I have a podcast on set point theory, which I think goes into this discussion quite a bit, at least enough where you'll have a good understanding as to like, what are some of these and how do they play a role in our predisposition for fat gain. So again, hope you enjoyed the episode. If you have a question, you can always DM me and I'll see you guys in the next episode.